Debora Spar is the 7th president of Barnard College. Since her arrival at the college, Dr. Spar has been a vocal proponent of women's education and leadership. She spearheaded initiatives that include the Athena Center for Leadership Studies, an interdisciplinary center devoted to the theory and practice of women's leadership. She's a political scientist by training. Her scholarly research focuses on issues of international political economy. She's the author of numerous books, and one of them, her most recent one, is Wonder Women: Sex, Power, and the Quest for Perfection. Dr. Spar is a graduate of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and she received her doctorate in government from Harvard. She's a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and currently serves as a director of Goldman Sachs. Prior to coming to Barnard, Spar was a Spangler Family Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Please join me in welcoming Debora Spar.
Thank you very much, and I apologize, I will literally run out the door at 5:30, but I'm delighted you all took time to be here this afternoon, and I have to tell you that you guys win. I think I have given this talk conservatively 100 times at various colleges and universities across the country in the past 14 months, and this is far and away the most diverse audience I've ever had, particularly in terms of men. So kudos to all the men for being here today. I gave this talk at the business school at Wharton a couple of months ago, and there was literally one guy in the room, so you win hands down. Thank you for being here. But let me tell you the story of, or the central theme of this book. The book essentially asks the question of where do American women stand today, and why haven't we come farther? So the second question essentially gives you the answer to the first one. And I should say by way of background that, I think most people would logically presume that you see a book like this by a person with a background like mine, and you figure, right, this is a woman who's been working on women's issues all her life. Well, not at all true. I actually spent the early and bulk years of my career actively avoiding anything that had to do with women's issues. I was not the member of any diversity committees. I never joined the Women's Studies Association. I never joined the Women's Faculty Association, even to the horror of all of my colleagues at Barnard College. Even though I have a PhD in political science, I never took a single course in feminist theory. For whatever reasons, I decided early on that I was going to kind of ignore the fact that I was female. Now, clearly at a biological and philosophical level, I understood I was female, but I steered away from it. And I spent all of my life in very male environments, Harvard Business School, Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and I was majoring in things that were kind of as macho as you could get. I was supposed to be a Soviet military analyst. Didn't quite work out. The Soviet Union fell apart, and I had to find other things to do. But I wasn't going to do kind of the women's stuff, and I didn't for all of my career. Until at some point, when I had already been on the faculty of Harvard Business School for about 15 years, over some period of time, I noticed that people kept coming to me and asking me to solve the women's problem. And I must say that although I failed miserably and didn't do anything to solve the women's problem at Harvard Business School, I finally realized that there was a women's problem at Harvard Business School. And I hasten to add, it was no worse or no different than the women's problem that exists at Northwestern or Chicago or Yale or Princeton or Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or pretty much any corporation in this country. But there was a women's problem. And the women's problem, quite simply, was that there weren't enough women. And because there weren't enough women in these important places, women were having a very different experience than men. And so I just started looking at some very, very basic data. And apologies to those of you who've heard me say this earlier today. But what I realized very quickly, because it's not complicated data, is that regardless of what sector you look at in this country, once you get to the top of any of these sectors, once you get to the positions of power, the women essentially disappear. So if you look at medicine, law, academia, corporate America, Hollywood, pick your sector. when you look at the top levels, whether it's the boards of directors, the operating committees, the tenured faculty, the most highly compensated, pretty much however you cut it, the percentage of women is stuck at somewhere between 15 and 20%. And what I found so fascinating and sad about this number is, first of all, how low it is. That you would have thought that women would be closer to equity. But what I found even more interesting was how constant it was. Because I didn't find that women were 18% in some sectors and 32% in some others. It was always between 15 or 20%. And even more remarkably, it's almost always 16%. It's astonishing how often the number 16 comes up. And I can't give you a scientific explanation for why 16% is so common, but I will throw out a word I hate, and that word is tokenism. Because what I think we're seeing across the United States is we have now reached a point societally where most people in positions of authority kind of know they need a woman. They kind of know they need two, and they know they need at least one person of color. So in any sort of top-level group, people are subconsciously checking off, oops, I got to have a couple of women, I got to have a person of color. If I can get a woman who happens to be a person of color, that's great because she's a double whammy, and then we're done. And if you look across this country, you see this same pattern repeating itself over and over and over. And when I look back on my own life, when I was sort of, in my mid-40s, I began to realize what I probably should have learned or thought about years ago, which was that I had kind of reached a point where over and over again, I was the only woman in the room. And to be totally honest, I probably got lots and lots of career advantages by being the only person in the room. But in the broader societal sense, this was very scary that there were so few women in the tops of any organizations. And when I looked a little bit more broadly, by this point in my life, I had taught literally thousands of Harvard MBAs, because the classes at Harvard are probably larger than your classes are here. So I had taught thousands and thousands of them. Every single one of those students was incredibly smart. Every single one of them was incredibly ambitious. Every single one of them had paid a fortune for their MBA. And yet when I looked back at their lives and their evolving careers, virtually all of the men I taught had gone on to very successful careers. They had become hedge fund managers and were running internet startups and were heads of companies. And virtually none of the women had achieved that level of success. There were a couple who had become household names, but I could actually count them on one, maybe two hands. So for men, going into business and getting an MBA was kind of a guarantee of career success. For women, it wasn't. So I started playing around with the idea for a book that at the time I was calling Confessions of a Reluctant Feminist. That's actually still the real title of this book. It's the real title of the book because, as you'll realize in a few minutes, the book is way more confessional than I ever really intended it to be. Because I wound up telling stories of my own life, and I think I'm still making up for the fact that I never took that feminist theory course that I probably should have. But it's also Confessions of a Reluctant Feminist, because I never wanted to be a feminist. And I come to my feminism reluctantly, not because I think feminism is a bad thing, but because I thought it was over. I thought we didn't need it anymore. And so the book is a story of a reluctant form of feminism. What I also discovered was that when it came time to publish this book, no publisher would publish a book with the word feminist in the title, because apparently no one will buy a book with the word feminist in the title. People will, however, apparently buy books with the word sex in the title, which is why my book now has this title. But apologies, there's actually not a lot of sex in the book. It's a little bit, but not very much. So I want to tell you one more story, and then I'll jump into the actual argument of the book. And the story is a silly story, but it will give you a sense of kind of how the book unfolds and what kind of narrative it tells. So the story happened a number of years to me back when I was still living in Boston, and it was the story of just like a bad day. And it wasn't a horrible day. Nobody died. Nothing tragic happened. It was just one of these days when I had a really bad day. And the irony, at least to me, was that it started out being a really good day. Because one of the advantages of being an academic is that you can work at home from time to time. And I was working at home because I had to write a presentation on stem cell technology, a topic about which I know kind of nothing. But I had to give a presentation at a medical school that night, and I knew they would actually know something about stem cell technology, so I was going to have to figure something out. So I gave myself a whole day to do some research and put this thing together. And I was working, I had a study on the 3rd floor of my house. And just as I was getting going and starting to figure this thing out, my eldest son, who at that point was 17, starts running up and down the stairs because he had taken the day off too because he was writing his college application essays, a moment that I suspect many of you remember, perhaps not very fondly. And as he was somewhat hysterically putting these essays together, he was realizing that he had forgotten everything, like his birth date and his social security number and where he wanted to go to school. So he was running up and down the stairs to ask me all these questions, and I'm getting distracted from my work. Then my second son called me, who was a little bit younger, and he's sort of my rude son, so he just let me know in no uncertain terms that he had 42 after-school activities to go to, and I had to get him to all of those activities, but I couldn't reach him because he had dropped his cell phone under a moving car. So I should sort of figure this out. And then my daughter called, and she's my sweet child, and she told me that she had forgotten her piano books and her soccer uniform and everything else, but I should somehow make these things materialize. So I'm now watching my day kind of retreat further and further into the distance when my cat shows up. And the cat has brought me a half-dead chipmunk. Now, I'm not very good with rodents to begin with, but like a fully dead chipmunk I could have handled. But this poor thing was half dead, and it was lying curled up on my rug, bleeding, with its last little dying chipmunk breaths going out of it. And I'm trying to figure out what the heck I'm going to do with this rodent on top of everything else. So I managed to, I put the chipmunk in a box, and I give the chipmunk the cat food, which seemed only fair, and I threw the cat out the window. And the day was now totally disintegrating, and just as I'm dealing with the rodent, my husband calls. And he was supposed to be taking care of the house and the kids that night while I went off to give the stem cell presentation that I now am not writing. And he calls to let me know, it's only like October. We live in Boston, and he's calling from Buffalo to let me know that there's been some kind of a freak snowstorm in Buffalo, and the airport's closed, and the roads are closed, and the car agencies are closed, and he's not going to be home for like 9.5 months. But he says very sweetly, "Is there anything I can do to help?" Fast forward, I never wrote the stem cell presentation. I had to show up at Harvard Medical School and wing it. And I'm pretty good at winging it, but not on stem cell technologies at Harvard Medical School. So the day was a total disaster. My kids were all angry at me. And I get home, and the final insult to injury is that the chipmunk has died. And at this point in time, I realized I have only two choices. I can either kill somebody, or I can indulge in my form of therapy, which is writing. So thankfully, I chose the nonviolent option, and I just wrote the story of this day. I probably had a glass of wine, and I stuck the story in my desk drawer, and I forgot about it. Now fast forward. I'm now president of Barnard College, and the Wall Street Journal comes up with this really, really nasty but really brilliant idea. And what they do is they ask 10 college presidents to agree to write their own college application essay, which will be published in the Wall Street Journal the day that colleges release their admissions decisions. Okay, it's very clever, and it's really nasty, because they don't tell you what question you're going to get until you agree to do this. So I agree to do this, and then, of course, they send me world's worst college application question. Describe an average day in your life and how you find solace in routine. A question I now tell you is no longer part of the Barnard admissions package, but it was back then. And so I'm thinking, how the heck I'm going to answer this horrible question? But I know a little bit about how you write a college application essay. It's too late for all of you, but you should know you never actually answer the question. You turn it on its head and you try and say something else clever, because the poor admissions officers have read everything answer to that question. So I remembered my dead chipmunk story. And so I took the dead chipmunk story out of the desk drawer where I had buried it, and I wrote 3 sentences on the top of it. I said, "I wish I could describe an average day in my life, but as every working mother knows, there's no such thing as routine." Wrote these 3 sentences, sent it away, and by this point I had written 7 books and like zillions of articles. Nothing I ever wrote got as much attention as this silly story in the Wall Street Journal. And truly, for years afterwards, I would be at fancy, serious academic events, and people would come over to me and go, "You're the dead chipmunk lady, right?" And, you know, it makes for a kind of a goofy story, but I realized something serious. I realized that I had told a story that no one else on the planet had ever experienced. Nobody had had a day like my dead chipmunk day. But in fact, everybody had had a day just like my dead chipmunk day, particularly working mothers, working parents, working people. It was one of those days where no matter how smart you are and how hard you're working and how good your intentions are, you're just blowing it. And your day is falling apart and you're taking career risks and it's not even your fault. And I realized I had struck a nerve with this story. And so when the time came to write this book, I decided to weave the chipmunk story, writ large, into the book, and to tell the story of women's lives, not just from the perspective of the data, the 16% and the questions of why women are leaving these fields in such large numbers, but to tell the messy story of women's lives, because I actually think it is the messiness. It's the kids and the husbands and the dead chipmunks and the chaos of everyday life that actually explains a lot of the data we're seeing. Let me stop for 1 second. Those of you who are standing in the back, there's like tons of seats up here. So please, come on in. I won't embarrass you, I promise. So I decided to use this chipmunk story and stories like it to tell the story of women's lives. And one of the things that I realized right off the bat was if I was going to tell the story of women's lives, I kind of had to start with my own story. And what that meant, and this is the central caveat of the book, once I started using my own life as the basis for part of this book, I had to be who I was. And, you know, I am who I am, like we all are. I happen to be white, I'm straight, I'm happily married, I'm very overeducated, and I've been lucky enough never to have been poor. And so the book comes from the perspective of a woman like me. And I think that's really important to put out there because I can't claim to speak for all women. And I don't think anyone can claim to speak for all women or all people. So I'm telling my story, and I hope and I think it has resonance across other, different age groups, different experiences, but I don't want to claim universality because I can't. The other thing that rapidly became clear to me, and this in fact is one of the central arguments of the book, is that my age became really important. Not the age I am so much, but the year in which I was born. Because one of the things I argue in the book, and most of you in this room are probably too young to fully appreciate this yet, but just indulge me for a moment. Feminism in this country has moved really, really quickly for the past 50 years. It's moved so quickly, in fact, that women who were born just 10 years apart from each other have had fundamentally different experiences with feminism. So women who were born 10 years ahead of me, earlier than me, tend to be much more feminist than my generation was. Women who were born when most of you were born generally were brought up not being feminist. That may change for the next generation, but history has moved very, very quickly. And I argue in the book that the year in which a woman was born actually has a lot to do with shaping her views on feminism because we are all prone to the cultural influences that surround us, particularly when we're kids. So again, most of you are too young to fully appreciate what I'm about to say, but hear me out, I hope. So I was born in 1963, which turns out to have been a really important year in the history of feminism. 1963 was the year when Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was published, which turns out to have been probably the most important book in American feminism, not because it's a particularly brilliant book, although it's a very good book, but because this was the book that took feminism mainstream. Feminism was really sort of an academic advocacy movement, and Betty Friedan's book pushed it into the broader consciousness. So to tell one more quick story, I was giving a version of this talk a couple of months ago at the New York Historical Society, and it was a much, much older crowd. And so one of the ladies came up to me afterwards, and she said, I have to tell you something. I was in a book group in 1963 We read The Feminine Mystique. The next week, we all went out, got jobs, and the book group never met again. Now, it's a very cute story, but it gives you a sense of the power of a book. This book changed women's lives. And from 1963 till about 1973-75, women's history in this country moved really, really quickly. History in general moved quickly. The civil rights movement really reached its peak in the late 1960s. Woodstock, sort of the epitome of free love, occurred in the late 1960s. The Cuban Missile Crisis happened. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Roe v. Wade was passed, making birth control legal across the country. Contraception became widely available, and Title IX was passed. So huge changes in a 10-year period. Girls of my age, however, were too young to be aware of any of it. Because by the time we became teenagers, by the time we became politically active, all of the change had already happened. So women of my age tended not to be politically active around issues of birth control and contraception. Why not? Because we had it. We never had to fight for it. Our mothers had to fight for it. We never had to fight for it. So we didn't become politically active. We didn't, and this is the confessional part, we didn't become feminists. Why not? Because our mothers were feminists. And as I'm sure most of you can attest, whatever your mother does, by definition, is not cool. So we thought feminism was sort of something that our mothers did. And if you read the mainstream media around feminism, which is what I was reading when I was, your age and younger, you would have come away believing, as I did, that feminists for the most part were angry, ugly, never shaved their legs, and hated men. This was not attractive to me. So I did not become a feminist. I did not take feminist theory. Instead, what I argue in the book is that what girls my age aspired to was Charlie. Now, you will not remember this ad, but take my word for it. This was one of the most successful ads of all time, and it was everywhere in the early to mid-1970s. The ad is for Charlie perfume, which went on to become one of the best-selling commercial products of all time. It's not because the perfume is good, it's horrible. But the ad is brilliant. So for those of you who are in marketing or communications, this ad is worth noticing because it was so successful. Look at what it does. First of all, it has an interesting name. It's a women's perfume with a man's name, Charlie. It's cool. It has very few words. What are the only words that you see here? Gorgeous, sexy, young. These are good words. Do you want to be gorgeous, sexy, and young? Yes. These are aspirational words. What does it mean to be gorgeous, sexy, and young? Well, it means you're a career woman, right? The ad doesn't say so, but it's very clear here that gorgeous, sexy, and young are things associated with being a working woman. Now, the ad says something interesting, of course, about what it means to be a working woman. What does it say? Well, first of all, you're gorgeous. Secondly, you're very fashionable. This was in the era when pantsuits were cool. And we know she's going to work how? She's got a briefcase, okay? But look at the briefcase. This is not a heavy briefcase. This is not a briefcase of a woman who is being brought down by her work. She's just got a briefcase, and she's going to work. And she's happy, and she's gorgeous, and she's sexy and young. This was the image of working women that was portrayed in the 1970s. In a later version of this ad, it's the same model, Shelley Hack. She's got the briefcase in one hand and a baby in the other. Okay? You have no idea what's happening to the baby. You don't know where the baby is going. You don't know if the baby is sick. You don't know if the baby has childcare. All you know is she's going to work and she's got a baby and it's all good. And at the end of this ad, which was on TV, it's clearly end of the day. She's coming home from work. There is no briefcase anymore. There is no baby anymore. And she's in a bar with a very attractive man squirting her with perfume. So if you're growing up and these are the ads you see, you think, yes, I would like that life. Do I want to be a feminist? No, I want to be Charlie. This was the much more attractive ad. And now we reached a point of sort of absurdity. But again, this is what you were seeing in the 1970s. in addition to Charlie the perfume, we have Charlie the Angels. All right? Now, you all may remember a newer version of this, but this was the most popular television show when I was a teenager. Notice again the word Charlie. Charlie was a very, very good name in the 1970s. But notice who, now this is, of course, this is absurd television. But these are working women, all right? What does it mean to be a working woman if you're watching Charlie's Angels? Well, again, you're gorgeous. B, you're working. C, you're working for an invisible boss named Charlie who you never see. And you're going to work in a bikini. Now again, I didn't really believe my life would be like this, but I thought it might be kind of like this. And I may have been a bit more superficial, but probably not much more superficial. And what I argue in the book is that millions of young girls, young women like me, did go off to college and did go off into the workforce, kind of believing that we would have it all. Because this is what we had been told from birth. You know, the feminists, who we didn't like, had sort of handed us all this stuff. But now we could have jobs and careers and sex and money and men and babies, and it was all just going to work out. And what I argue in the book is that women of my age didn't realize until much later in their lives that, in fact, reality was going to turn out to be much messier than we ever anticipated. So as a result of this misconception, I argue, women of my generation, without meaning to, made two crucial mistakes. The first one was that we privatized feminism. Because feminism, of course, was never about this. It was not about Charlie Perfume or Charlie's Angels. But it was my generation that turned it inside. And we made feminism about my personal success, how I look, how successful my kids are, what career I have. We privatized it. The second thing we did, and sadly we have now imposed this on young women of your generation, is that we ratcheted up the expectations that we place on women and girls. So just think about the history here for a second. In the bad old days of pre-feminism, women were expected to do just a couple of things. They're expected to be pretty, get married, have babies, and make dinner. Not a particularly exciting set of requirements, but manageable. You can do that in a 40-hour week. Then feminism comes along, and now we say to young women, you can be a business executive, you can be a neuroscientist, you can be a Supreme Court justice. But we never got rid of the, oh, and be pretty, get married, have babies, and make dinner. That is no longer doable in a 40-hour week. Because if you're going to be a neuroscientist and try and look good, have babies, get married, and cook dinner, the math starts to get to you because there's not enough hours in the week. And we never took any of the expectations off the table. And what I worry about when I look at my students who are now kind of 3 generations post-feminist is now we've said, be pretty, get married, have babies, and be a neuroscientist, and play on the traveling soccer team, and play with trucks, and learn engineering, but wear a tutu and look beautiful all the time. And when I see my students at Barnard showing up, they're fabulous young women, and I love them, but they're exhausted because they've been running so hard in high school that by the time they get to college, they're already feeling a bit defeated. Now, I think some of these same expectations are true for young men, but I don't think they're as heavy because we haven't really taken any of the female expectations and put them on young boys, whereas for women, we've taken all the old expectations of girls and women and added to them. And I don't say that, I don't think the boys have done anything wrong, but essentially for young men, we have, I wouldn't say lower, but more minimal sets of expectations. And I would love to hear from some of you when I stop talking. And let me give you one example of these higher expectations or these multiple expectations. And it's an extreme example, but I think it's a telling one. So you may remember this woman. This is Marion Bartoli. She won the women's singles championship at Wimbledon last year. So she's 23 years old at the time of this photo. She's French. Her father has been her coach for her whole life. And so here she is. She's literally just won Wimbledon. So we see her at a moment which, sadly, I suspect nobody in this room will experience. Because right now, she is the best person in the world at her chosen profession. She's the top. So she shows up for her first interview, live televised interview with the BBC. And the BBC interviewer sits her down And the first words out of his mouth are as follows. He says, "So, Marion, I guess at some point your father turned to you and said, you'll never be a looker, so you might as well play tennis." This is what happens to women all the time, that they're being evaluated on things that have nothing to do with their professional qualifications. Think about, regardless of your personal or political views of her, Hillary Clinton. Probably the most successful woman on the planet, and yet we're constantly hearing about her hair, her makeup, her pantsuits, her mothering abilities, her grandmothering abilities. We don't do this to men, or at least we don't do it at nearly the same level. Just to give you some business examples, Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon, two of the leading financial world CEOs, they are constantly being compared as corporate CEOs. Nobody ever asks who's a better father. In fact, most people don't even know if they have kids. Certainly, they don't know anything about their parenting skills. And yet, when you think about Sheryl Sandberg and Marissa Mayer, two of the most prominent female CEOs, we always hear about their childcare arrangements and their marriages and their clothing and their hairstyles. This is what I call in the book, it's the double whammy. It's just that we're evaluating women and girls on a much broader set of criteria than we evaluate men. So let me very, very quickly now go through the overall, and I really will do this quickly, sort of structure of the book, because you've already, I think, gotten a good sense of the argument. But what I do in the book is I go through sort of the stages of a woman's life. And for each stage, I ask these questions of how do the expectations play out? How are women's lives different than men's? So I start by talking about girls and how we raise girls. And I give you a sense of this already. What I argue in the book is that we basically are confusing the heck out of girls because we're throwing so many expectations at them. Be good in soccer, but be pretty. Do well in school, but don't let the boys know how smart you are. For boys, we have a simpler set of expectations. Then I look at beauty and body image. And I don't think the chapter cuts any new ground, but it does raise some very disturbing implications that I think are worth just going over for a moment. Because one of the basic tenets of feminism was that we would stop evaluating women on the basis of their looks. How many of you think that has happened? No. If anything, I would argue we've probably gone the other way, because we now have standards of feminine beauty, of female beauty, that are almost literally impossible. Because when you look at any woman in a magazine, first of all, she's a model, so she's naturally gorgeous. Secondly, she's probably 17 years old, no matter how old she's portrayed in the magazine. An ostensibly middle-aged lady in a magazine is actually a 17-year-old model. And she's been photoshopped. So the women you're looking at literally are not real. I'm sure everyone in this room is very bright, and so you know intellectually that the picture you're seeing is not a real woman, but you don't really know. And the magazines just egg you on because they're so aspirational. They're about trying harder. Just think of any of the headlines, walk your way to thinner thighs. Eat more broccoli and get J-Lo's butt. Well, you can eat all the broccoli in the world you want. You're not going to get J-Lo's butt because A, it's her butt, not yours, and B, it's been photoshopped. And you know this, but you don't know this. We don't know this. And so I put this one picture up here just because I find it kind of interesting. So when I was starting this book a couple of years ago, somebody said to me, yeah, but at least we don't have corsets anymore. I'm like, yeah, great, no corsets. And then I thought about it. I'm sure corsets were really uncomfortable, but you got to take them off at the end of the day. Now what we have is essentially the same body image. So we're supposed to have the same body as we did with the corset, but without the corset. So what does that mean? It means you're dieting, you're going to the gym, you're making yourself crazy, and you're still wearing Spanx. So I'm not sure that we've actually evolved all that much. And the sad and the scary part of this chapter is I talk about anorexia. And anorexia, although there are men who get anorexia is largely a disease of perfect girls. Anorexia is the disease that girls get when they're trying too hard, way too hard to achieve this body. And I argue in the book that ultimately I don't think anorexia is about body image at all. It's about control. And when young women are being bombarded with all of these expectations of things they should be doing and levels of perfection they should achieve, I think far too many of them focus in on the one thing they actually can control, which is their bodies. And that's why we're seeing really such epidemic rates of anorexia. The next chapter is the one where I do talk about sex. And it was a very painful chapter to write. And I'm always a bit nervous sort of describing what I argue there. I thought for sure that they were going to throw me off the Barnard campus when my students started reading this book. But I've actually been somewhat surprised by the level at which people seem to have accepted it. Because what I look at the book, in part, is the hookup culture. And I argue that I'm not sure the hookup culture is really all that empowering for young women. And it's not very politically correct to say that. But essentially what my students report in terms of their sexual norms is that there's an awful lot of uncommitted, promiscuous sex, which is great if that's what you want. But it turns out that the young men generally like uncommitted, promiscuous sex, and the girls would prefer to be in a relationship. And yet if the girls are all having the promiscuous, uncommitted sex, it seems to me that the boys won, which was not what was supposed to happen. Not that somebody has to win here, but I just put this out there as something worth thinking about. Are the sexual norms that we have now prevailing on college campuses and sort of through people's 20s, are these in fact empowering for women or not? And if they're not empowering, how can women start thinking about different norms of sexuality that might be more in line with what they actually want? The next chapter of the book looks at marriage. You'll see it still follows fairly conventional narrative of a woman's life. And here I raise the question of why we're still getting married. Because basically marriage doesn't make sense anymore. And I say this, I've been very happily married for 28 years, but as an economist, I feel sort of compelled to say marriage has historically been an economic contract. It's a financial relationship, and if you read any traditional marriage ceremony, it actually reads like a real estate deal. The woman is given to the man in exchange for something. Well, we don't really believe that anymore, yet why are we still getting married at such high levels, at high rates? And why, in particular, have same-sex couples for whom the underlying economic contract makes no sense at all, why have they embraced what by any means is a conservative heterosexual tradition? And I say this as someone, I'm a huge supporter of gay marriage, but it just doesn't make sense economically. And the hypothesis I put out there, I have no idea if it's true or not, but I think we're getting married in such high numbers, and we're sort of celebrating the white wedding because societally, we don't want to acknowledge how hard marriage actually has become. Because in the bad old days, again, marriage was pretty simple. You married the person your parents selected for you, you produced children, and that was kind of it. You didn't have to like each other. Now, we have this bizarre sort of progression where we're supposed to have very promiscuous, passionate sex for about 10 years, build our careers, suddenly find the right person, fall passionately in love, have the same kind of passionate sex with the same person now for like 100 years, because we live forever, while we're co-parenting and cooking organic mushrooms in our backyard. It's hard. And I think rather than acknowledging how hard it's become, we just focus on the wedding, because that's easy. So sorry to be quite so depressing. Again, happily married for 28 years, so big fan of the institution. I then turned to look at babies and children, now from the sort of the reproductive side. And I wrote my last book on reproductive medicine, so I sort of cover some of the old ground there. But here I look at the whole emerging business, because it is a business of reproduction, of buying eggs, buying sperm, freezing eggs, freezing embryos, and somehow believing that you can control your reproduction the same way you can control other aspects of your life. So here's now my public service announcement, particularly the women in the room. Reproduction is harder to control. Your body doesn't always do exactly what you hope it will. And this sort of idea out there, which has now gotten very much in the public eye with Apple's decision to pay for women to freeze their eggs, which is a good thing for them to do, but I think it also fosters this misconception that somehow women can control their fertility in line with their careers and make it all work perfectly. Life is messier than that. Children are messier than that. And again, I think we're falling into these heightened expectations. And it's actually rather a dangerous thing to fall into. The next chapter looks at the workplace. And what I draw on there is, to a large extent, my personal experience. I've had this very strange career. So I spent the first 20 years of my professional life at Harvard Business School, which is a very male place. And then I moved to Barnard College, where you can't find testosterone with a search party. And it's really different. Nobody would ever mistake Harvard Business School for Barnard College. And I actually think that's important. And again, it's not politically correct to say so, but I personally feel that workplaces that are dominated by men are different than workplaces dominated by women. It's not that one is better than the other, but they're different. And if you throw women in a workplace dominated by men, they're going to have a hard time. Just as if you throw men in a workplace dominated by women, they're going to have a hard time. I've had to hire more men at Barnard because we didn't have enough. And I think, you know, ultimately the chapter is an argument for diversity. That if you really want the best workplace, you've got to get this mix. And it's not just in terms of genders, but gender is a good place to start. And I also, and I'm happy to do it during questions, I go into some of the differences I see between how men lead and how women lead. Because again, I think they're different. They're not better or worse. But I believe the two genders in general lead and manage differently. And I think we actually have to understand those differences if we want to help women succeed, and ultimately help men succeed as well. And then the last two chapters, most of you in this room are going to be too young for, but I'll just tell you the scary things that lie ahead. The next chapter looks at housework. Now, this is always the one that makes people giggle because housework is just kind of silly. But what I argue in the chapter is that housework, I think, is one of the things that explains a lot of the issues that women are facing. Because you would have thought that as women moved into the workplace and as they started becoming law partners and getting marketing degrees and everything that you all are embarked upon doing, you would have thought that they would have stopped doing as much housework. And yet the data are very clear. Women today, even working women, do more hours of housework a week than women in the 1950s did. So if you watch Mad Men, they were just like drinking martinis all the time. Now women are doing over 40 hours a week of housework. This is what's killing us. Or at least one of the major things that's killing us, because again, it's the math. Any fast-track job is going to be 60 to 70 hours a week. If you're doing 60 or 70 hours a week in the workplace and then coming home and doing 40 hours, you're dead. You're not going to make it. And this would be sort of an obvious place to beat up on men, but I actually don't. Men are doing an increasing amount of housework. It's still way below the level that women are doing, but they're increasing. What I argue is I beat up on the magazines here. Because I think what's happened is, we've ratcheted up the expectations. Rather than expecting, houses to be a little bit dirtier if both parents are working, we expect our households to be perfect. So here are just a few images. These are all sort of from October magazines. They're the same thing for any month. The colors just change. But, this is what your Halloween costumes are supposed to look like. This is like a 40-hour costume. This is not a costume you buy at a store. This is a costume that has to be lovingly sewn on your after work. And, it's very easy, and I know every woman here is saying, I will never do this, but you will. Because if every other kid in the school looks like this and you send your kid to school with a paper bag over his head, it's going to be a bad day. So you fall into this. And we all fall into, this is like the bane of every working mother's existence, the bake sale. Okay? These are 4-hour cupcakes. And when you finish the 4-hour cupcakes, they're not going to look as good as these 4-hour cupcakes. And you're going to be angry. There's going to be green goo all over your kitchen. People will be screaming. And then when you're done with the costumes and the cupcakes, you're supposed to be taking care of the wildlife in your backyard. Now, again, you're all sitting here going, I will never do this. But you will. Unless your generation smartens up and you stop competing like mine did on the basis of silly things like who can bake a better cupcake. Now, if you're into cupcakes, that's fine. But if you're a neuroscientist with 3 kids, you probably don't have time to bake the cupcakes, either as a man or as a woman. But the men seem to have figured this out better. And as I said earlier, most men I know, if they have a major presentation to make tomorrow, they're not going to mow the lawn tonight. It can wait. Whereas if the woman has the exact same presentation to make tomorrow, she's home baking the cupcakes. And this is what we need. We have to stop doing. The last chapter of the book talks about aging. You're all too young to worry about this, but let me just tell you the thing about aging is it doesn't end well. And it particularly doesn't end well if you take these expectations of physical perfection and drag them all the way into your 90s. This is what we have done. So women are not allowed to get old in this country. Men can get old. There's a lot of attractive older men. Just watch the movies, watch any television broadcast, no older women, except Meryl Streep. She's the only exception and she doesn't count. All right, so And British women. We allow British women to get old. So after all this depression, I actually end the book, as I will end my comments now, on a perhaps surprising note of optimism. Because despite all these issues, I think these are actually fixable problems. You know, this isn't the conflict in the Middle East. It's not a zero-sum game. All of these are things that we can fix. There's no magic switch. We can't flick them overnight. But I think your generation has a lot of room to change things. And I think even my generation can start doing things differently. So what do we need to do? The first thing is we need to give up on the notion of perfection. It's a really bad idea. Nobody is perfect. And I think the burden is actually on, women of my age who have achieved some level of success. We need to tell our dead chipmunk stories. We need to make clear that any woman out there who is a professional woman who has achieved some measure of success has got a dirty underside. Not all the balls are in the air, not everything is working. Nobody is perfect. We need to move away from that. And your generation needs to do a better job on social media of not only bragging about all the beautiful stuff. It's very tempting, but I think social media is just exacerbating these issues that everybody on social media is gorgeous and perfect and happy. Not quite true. The second and related point is we have to, and you guys have to, realize that everybody makes trade-offs in their life. I don't know who concocted the phrase having it all, but it's a horrible phrase and we need to get rid of it. We never ask men if they're having it all because nobody has it all. We need to stop asking women if they're having it all. Every successful woman has made trade-offs, just like every successful man has. And I think women of my generation need to be more honest in saying, okay, this is what I do well, this is what I don't do at all. This is where I'm terrible. This is what I ignore. And I think women of your generation need to start thinking proactively, not that you can plan everything out, but what are the things that really matter to you? What do you really want? And what are the things where you're willing to make sacrifices? Because you'll have to make sacrifices. No matter what you do, you will sacrifice other things, and that's okay. But you're much better off thinking early about what matters to you and what doesn't than trying to do it all. Because if you try and do it all, you won't do any of it very well. Crucially, and again, this room wins, we need to bring men into the conversation. Usually I have this conversation, it's all women in the room, everybody feels good, they leave the room and nothing changes. We will only change if we bring men into the conversation. It's not because women are incompetent or can't do it, it's because men hold 85% of the positions of power. So unless they're part of the conversations, we'll never move the needle. And the problem is that it's tough for men to come into conversations like this. It makes them a little uncomfortable. It's a little yucky at points. They don't feel like they have ownership of the conversation. So men have to feel part of it. And we need to drag them in. They need to come. And again, this is truly the highest percentage of men I've seen in a room in a really long time. We also need, and this one's a little bit more controversial, but we need to realize that biology matters. And this is where I do fault the early feminists. The early feminists kind of thought if you change the social structure, women would behave exactly like men. I don't think that's true. And I say this, as I mentioned, I wrote my last book on reproductive medicine, so I can tell you with 100% scientific certainty, women have babies and men don't. And this is actually a pretty big deal. Because if you look at the data, if you look anecdotally at people's lives, men and women diverge at the point at which they have children. Because women bear the children and men don't. And this is actually a very, very big deal. And it's not something that can be solved just with maternity leaves. We need to realize that parenting is a lifetime experience. And the workplace has to start accommodating parents, not just women giving birth. And I think where we'll really start to see this change, interestingly, is actually with same-sex couples. Because as more and more same-sex couples become parents, they're going to force the workplace to change because it's no longer a gender issue, it's a parenting issue. So we need to recognize biology, but we also need to realize that women are going to be different, and the workplace has got to accommodate that. And then finally, the last thing we need to do, and this brings me full circle now and I will close, is we actually need to go back to feminism's earliest goals. Because again, feminism wasn't about the cupcakes or the perfume or any of that stuff. It was a collective social movement. It was about making the world more equal and better for everybody living in it. And we've forgotten that. We've forgotten these very quaint words that now sound quaint. Words like sisterhood. The idea of women actually working together to make things happen. Women, I'm sorry to say, women attack each other way too often. And we need to stop. We need to work together, even if we don't always agree. And we need to remember this other word that I love that we've lost is liberation. We were supposed to be liberating women. We were supposed to be freeing women. If all we've done is made women exhausted and miserable and feeling guilty all the time, we've lost the plot. We need to go back to the earlier goals and realize that at the end of the day, we're supposed to be creating lives of joy and lives that matter. And that's what we should be focusing on. So let me stop there. I have exactly 8 minutes for questions. So I hope that a couple of you will come and ask me some very quick questions. Thank you. And we've got a microphone right here, so you can just come up to the mic or put your hand up and scream.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that. And what would be your number one tip for raising children in a hydrogenous environment to start that feminism equality mindset from the get-go?
I'm going to give you a different answer than you probably expect. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I always have moms come up to me and say, my daughter plays with Barbie. I'm like, it's okay. It won't last forever. And I think to some extent, and I say this, I'm a mother, I have 2 boys and a girl, there is a little hard wiring there. I wouldn't fight it, but I would make sure that your kids are seeing as broad an array of parenting styles and lifestyles as possible. Make sure that, both kids are seeing dad doing the dishes or making dinner, whatever he does, and seeing mom going to work, or if mom doesn't go to work, and so going to work. Let them see the variation, and they'll figure it out.
One more.
Yeah.
How do you feel about same-sex education and how that affects?
Well, as the president of a women's college, I could only say one thing. But, I will say, I spent all of my life in co-educational environments. But, I've drunk the Kool-Aid at Barnard, as I would have to. But I really do feel that single-sex education, it's not for everybody. But I think it offers some incredible advantages. And we were saying it earlier. I think what it does for both genders, but particularly for women, is it gives them this space for at least a part of their lives when they don't have that gender bubble over their shoulder. I watch so many girls, particularly when I used to teach at a business school, they're always thinking, do I have to answer the women's question? When I put my hand up, am I talking like a girl? If you're in a women's college, that gender bubble disappears. And I see my students coming out really confident, which is nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned that you see that there's differences between the leadership styles of men and women. What do you think are some key differences?
Yeah, and so thanks for the question. I will say this with the caveat that people are always different, and so you can't completely generalize, but to generalize, I think men usually are much more comfortable with the notion and the exercise of authority than women are. Men kind of get that there's a guy at the top and there's people below him, and you listen to the guy at the top. Women tend to like to be liked. And the women at the top sometimes want everybody to like them, which makes exercising power, exercising authority, a more complicated endeavor. Men in general are more comfortable with conflict. So I used to say the biggest difference, and it was difficulty for me when I moved from Harvard to Barnard, was that at Harvard, everybody stabbed you in the front. And you get good at that, At Barnard, they come around the back, and it's very different. And at Harvard, people were very comfortable with direct conflict. At Barnard, people aren't. And you have to manage that differently. I've realized at Barnard, I can't be as confrontational as I was at Harvard because it makes people very nervous. But I've also had to get my team used to being more confrontational because otherwise nothing happens. I think places run by women tend to be more comfortable with and better at finding consensus, bringing everybody in, bringing everybody along, but it can also take a lot longer to get things done. So different. Again, not better or worse, but different. And then the sort of the silly but important one, just the stuff you talk about is different. My standard line was I had to learn a lot of Australian rugby trivia. at Harvard, just because people talk about it, and you have to kind of be part of the conversation. Whereas I was at a staff meeting at Barnard last week, and there were about 8 women around the table talking about handbags, and the 2 guys are there going, "Oh, come on, can we move on?" So it's it's just different. Just the tone of conversation is different. You have to get used to that. Do we have one more before I head to the airport? Yes, please.
So you talk about feminism, but there are numerous feminisms. And certainly the feminine mystique is more reflective of a white, middle-class, liberal feminism. Is it possible that that feminism led to this because of a confusion between freedom and license?
That's a really good question. I'm going to fudge it because I can't totally answer it, but it's a really good question. So I'm going to half answer it. First of all, I think there are multiple kinds of feminism. And I think the idea, I think most people could probably agree on the basics. Feminism is the crazy idea that women are equal to men. Most people get on board with that. Once you get below that, there's white professional feminism, there's lesbian feminism, there's whole issues around trans and whether trans is part of feminism or not. I don't think, rephrase that, I think we have to be careful not to try and shove everybody into the same tent, because there are many different strands. And I think one of the real problems I see right now is that all of the books on women's issues right now are being written by women who look like me. And in fact, we all know each other. We all went to graduate school together. I mean, it's really incestuous. And we need to start seeing these kinds of books by black women, gay women, poor women. It's hard. Poor women generally don't have the flexibility to write books, but somebody needs to capture their voices. And then we'll get a much more nuanced version. Because I think, yeah, there's a direct line from Betty Friedan to Sheryl Sandberg, for better and worse. And I think that's a fine line, but we need to diversify it. And I really, really hope so. I haven't seen much hitting the mainstream yet, and we need to get some of the more marginal aspects of feminism into the mainstream conversation. So let me end on that note. Thank you so much for being here, and good luck to you all.